Welcome everybody to my speech, Olympic Wrestling Must Survive. In this coming up September 2013, there's going to be a vote on which one of three sports will survive for the 2020 Olympic Games between baseball, softball, squash, and wrestling. Now wrestling needs some rule changes, I'll agree to that, to make it more interesting for the novice viewer. Baseball, America's pastime, I love baseball. However, it has no Olympic history whatsoever, and squash sounds to me like something you would dig out of your garden. Actually, it's a form of racquetball that you can play in your local gym. No Olympic history. Now, to a 10-year-old wrestler, boy or girl, wrestling is the height of achievement in Olympic wrestling. There's no money, there's no commercials, there's just the thought that you may someday be able to achieve an impossible task. Now, Olympic wrestling must survive for three reasons. The first reason Olympic wrestling must survive is that it has endured. It has endured the test of time. Author Louis Calabay goes back to the beginning of the Olympics and talks about when the Olympics ended in 394 AD after about 1,000 years of existence. The word Olympia is meant to promote the interest and the prestige of the countries involved with the Olympics. And for this reason, Pierre de Coubertin from France, back in the late 1800s, decided he was going to bring back the Olympics, called the modern Olympics. And that's where the phrase Olympism came from. And that means that the ancient games will always and forever be tied to the modern games. And that was one of the reasons they decided to bring back the modern Olympics. Now, New York Times reporter Ron Dicker, he reports that wrestling was the most important game to the ancient Greeks. It was the most important. Plato himself used to participate in the sport of wrestling. Egyptian tombs are littered with how-tos of wrestling. And Sumerian caves indicate that the sport of wrestling is over 7,000 years old. How can the IOC do away with the sport with this kind of time involved? Ron Dicker also reports that wrestling was blessed by the Greek gods. It was a final and deciding event in the Greek pentathlon. Now, I've given you one good reason why Olympic wrestling must survive. Reason number two is that wrestling has a rich history. Ron Dicker also reports that in the Middle Ages, King Henry VIII and King Francis I of France decided they were going to have a wrestling match. Well, King Francis won and had the bragging rights, and that was in the year 1520. In 1904, there was an 11-hour match, and this made the organizers decide they needed to set time limits for Olympic wrestling. In 1932, Ivar Johansson won a gold medal in freestyle wrestling, only to lose 10 pounds overnight and compete in Greco-Roman wrestling and win a gold medal the very next day. In 2004, women were added to the sport of Olympic wrestling, and I think that's a wonderful thing. Gary Kingston, a reporter for the Vancouver Sun, to let you know that this sport is international, wrote about the recent history of Olympic wrestling. Well, recent history will tell us where the future of Olympic wrestling is going. He reports that Canada Wrestling President Don Ryan said that in 2 months, the last 2 months, there's been more rule changes than his last 30 years of wrestling. And this is all to save the sport in the Olympics. And FILA President Nenad Lalovic, who is recently elected FILA president, is doing everything that he can to save the sport of wrestling in the Olympics. Now, we went over number one reason, wrestling has endured. Number two reason, that wrestling has a rich history. The third and final reason, and maybe more importantly, is that wrestling brings enemies together. Neil McFarquhar, formerly a reporter for the New York Times, reports on three enemies unite: Russia, Iran, and the United States. They got together at Grand Central Station in New York in a unified effort to support Olympic wrestling. There's no unified effort for baseball softball, or squash. Nothing can be said for those sports. FILA president Nenad Lalovic is quoted as saying, "We love our sport and we're united to save it." Iran and the U.S. have sent teams back and forth over about the last dozen years, so this was not the first time. And while Jordan Burroughs, the United States Olympic gold medalist, was in Tehran, he was almost trampled by adoring fans. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the hated Iranian president, made it a point to show up at that event just to shake Jordan Burroughs' hands. Pretty amazing. Wrestlers ignore politics. They don't care. They do care about the sport of wrestling when it comes to the Olympics. Nothing can be said like that for baseball, softball, or squash. They were hoping that the sight of these three enemies would melt the hearts of the International Olympic Committee. And in conclusion, I went over, like I said, three main points. Wrestling has endured, wrestling has a rich history, and wrestling brings political enemies together. Wrestling's been around for over 7,000 years. If there were no wrestling, Dan Gable wouldn't be who he is today. And most importantly, like I said before, wrestling brings enemies together. Do you think the president of Iran, Ahmadinejad, would show up at baseball, softball, or squash to support those events? I don't think so. Thank you.